The stampede came out of the dark like the end of the world, and Emmett Prescott's first thought, as 300 head of cattle broke from the bedding ground and thundered toward the sleeping camp, was that someone had planned it that way. He came awake with his hand already on his revolver, boots half-laced, the ground beneath his bedroll shuddering as if the earth itself had decided to run. Gunfire cracked somewhere past the remuda, 2 shots, then 3, deliberate and spaced, not the panicked fire of men startled by a herd but the calculated fire of men starting one. Up, everybody up. He shouted, and around him the other deputies and the 2 hired drovers scrambled for horses that were already screaming and pulling at their picket lines. Emmett got his sorrel gelding untied a heartbeat before the first wave of longhorns hit the camp, and after that there was no more thinking, only the roar of hooves and the bawling of terrified animals and the cold February wind driving grit into his eyes. He turned the sorrel into the flow of the herd, trying to bend them, the way any man who had spent a season on a cattle drive knew to do, angling his horse against the leaders to peel them off before they trampled the wagon and the sleeping camp entire. A young deputy named Cody Fisk was still on the ground, tangled in his own blanket, and Emmett put his horse between the boy and a wall of horns, leaning low, hauling Fisk up by the collar of his coat in half, dragging him across the saddle horn as the herd split around them like a river around a stone. That was when the ground gave beneath the sorrel's forefeet, a wash cut deep by the winter thaw and hidden under a skin of frost, and the horse went down hard, pitching Emmett into the dark. He remembered the sky wheeling above him, pale stars smeared by dust, and then a hoof caught his shoulder and everything narrowed to a single bright point of pain before the night closed over him entire. He did not know how long he lay there. When he came back to himself, the herd was gone, the thunder of it retreating into the foothills, and the camp behind him was a wreck of trampled ash and scattered gear. His sorrel had vanished. His badge case, and the papers inside it that named him Deputy United States Marshal Emmett Prescott, assigned by the Territorial Marshal's office in Santa Fe to the Lincoln County District, had vanished with the saddlebag that carried it, torn loose somewhere in the churn of mud and hide and terror. He got himself upright by degrees, testing his shoulder, finding it wrenched but not broken, and he understood, with the flat clarity of a man who had survived worse, that whoever had spooked this herd had known exactly what they were doing. 3 days he and 4 other deputies had spent recovering these very cattle from a rustler's holding pen in the Malpais east of the Capitan Range, driving them back toward their rightful owners along the Rio Ruidoso. Someone had not wanted that herd delivered. 2 miles away and closer to the river, Louisa Langston woke to the same thunder rolling through the dark, and she was on her feet and pulling on her boots before the sound had fully registered as danger rather than dream. "Tomas!" she called out across the yard, already moving toward the horse barn, her rifle in one hand and a coat only half buttoned over her nightclothes. "Tomas, get up, something's coming through the south pasture." Old Tomas Aguilar was already stumbling out of the bunkhouse, gray hair wild, pulling his suspenders over his shoulders as he ran. Louisa did not wait for him. She had built this ranch back up from her father's debts with her own 2 hands these past 2 years, had ridden every fence line herself, had learned the hard way what a herd could do to fencing and to horses caught unprepared, and she was not about to stand in her nightgown while 300 head of somebody else's cattle tore through her winter pasture. She reached the corral just as the first of the runners hit the fence line, splintering a rail with a crack like a rifle shot, and her own remuda, 12 good horses she had spent a hard winter keeping fed, bolted through the gap in a panic that matched the invading herd's own. She swung up onto Duchess, her sorrel-end white mare who had been saddled and waiting, because Louisa never went to bed without a horse ready in the New Mexico winter, not since the year the Vance outfit had run cattle through her hay meadow and called it an accident. She rode into the chaos trying to turn her own horses back, shouting until her throat burned, and somewhere in the dark and dust, she lost sight of Tomas entirely, lost sight of the lantern light from her own house, lost herself in a stretch of unfamiliar arroyo country half a mile from home before the herd finally thinned and scattered into the foothills, and left her alone with her blowing mare, and a silence that felt enormous after all that noise. It was nearly dawn, gray light bleeding up over the Sacramento mountains, before Louisa turned Duchess back toward home, exhausted, furious, already composing the letter she meant to send to the county sheriff about whoever had let that herd run loose on land that was not theirs. She did not yet know that the herd belonged to no rustler at all, but to 5 deputy marshals who had been driving it home, nor that one of those deputies lay half a mile from her own barn with a wrenched shoulder, and no memory yet of how he had gotten there. She found him 3 hours later, when she went out to check the damage to her hay barn and discovered the south door standing ajar, though she was certain she had barred it the night before. Louisa did not go in directly. She had grown up on this land, had buried her father here 2 winters past, and she had learned that a woman alone on a ranch in the New Mexico territory did not walk blind into dark places. She fetched her rifle from the house, checked the load, and approached the barn from the side, calling out in a voice that she was pleased to hear did not shake. "Whoever's in there had better speak up, because I've got a Winchester and I know how to use it." For a moment there was nothing but the shuffle of the milk cow in her stall and the wind working at loose shingles overhead. Then a man's voice came back to her, low and rough, pitched carefully to sound less threatening than it might have otherwise. "I'm not armed, ma'am. Leastways not with anything I can reach. I believe my gun's somewhere back in a wash 2 miles from here, along with my horse and most of my good sense." Louisa eased the barn door open with the muzzle of her rifle and found him sitting up against a stack of baled hay, one arm cradled against his body, his shirt torn and stiff with dried blood at the shoulder, his hat gone, his dark hair matted with mud. He was younger than his voice had suggested, 30 years old perhaps, with a lean, weathered face and eyes the color of a winter sky, gray shading toward blue, and those eyes tracked her rifle with the calm attention of a man who had faced down worse than a nervous rancher before. "You're hurt," she said, not lowering the rifle. "I am that. You came through my barn door in the night and didn't think to knock. I don't rightly remember coming through your barn door at all, ma'am. I remember a stampede, and I remember a bad fall, and I remember walking until I couldn't walk anymore, and then I remember hay, which struck me as about the finest thing I'd ever laid eyes on." Louisa studied him a long moment. There was cattle rustling talk all up and down the valley that winter, and a woman living alone with only an aging ranch hand for company could not afford to be careless with strangers who turned up bleeding in her outbuildings. But she had also spent enough years reading men, buyers and drovers and bank clerks who thought a widow's daughter running a ranch was an invitation to cheat her, to trust her own judgment over her fear, and something in this man's face, exhausted and pained as he was, did not strike her as dangerous so much as it struck her as careful. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated just long enough for her to notice it, and something in that hesitation should perhaps have worried her more than it did. "Emmett," he said. "Emmett Prescott." "Well, Mr. Prescott, you're bleeding on my hay, and I don't suppose I can in good conscience put a wounded man back out in a New Mexico February to bleed somewhere less convenient." She lowered the rifle, though she did not set it aside. "I'll get my needle and my whiskey, and you're going to tell me exactly how you came to be found half dead in my barn, and you're going to tell me the truth of it, because I have very little patience for men who lie to me on my own land." She did not yet know how much that promise would come to test them both. She sent Tomas, who had ridden in not long after her looking pale and shaken from his own long night chasing horses, to fetch her sewing kit and the bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes and nothing else. "Thank you very much." And together the two of them cleaned the gash along Emmett's shoulder where a hoof or a fence rail had opened the skin, and Louisa stitched it closed with the same steady hand she used for calving season. While Emmett gritted his teeth and did not make a sound beyond a single sharp breath when the needle first went in. "You've done this before," he said, when she tied off the last stitch. "On calves and on my father twice before he passed. Not so different, men and calves, when it comes to bleeding." She wiped her hands on a rag and sat back on her heels, studying him properly now that the panic of discovery had passed and left plain curiosity in its place. "You still haven't told me how a stampede 2 miles off left you in my barn with no horse and no memory of walking here." "That's because I don't have a clean answer, ma'am, and I'd rather not give you a dirty one." He met her eyes steadily, and there was something almost apologetic in it. "I was with a group driving a recovered herd back toward the river when it stampeded in the night. I got thrown, hit my head, and I don't recall much between that and waking up here. I know how that sounds. It sounds like the beginning of a story a man tells right before he asks to borrow a horse." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, the first she had seen from him. "I don't suppose I could borrow a horse." "You could not." She rose, brushing hay from her skirt. "You'll stay in the barn until that shoulder's fit to travel, and you'll earn your keep once you're able, mucking stalls same as anybody. And you'll forgive me, Mr. Prescott, if I keep my rifle within reach until I've had more reason to trust you than a fall and a stitched-up shoulder." "That seems fair," he said, and meant it, though he did not tell her that the herd he had been driving belonged to no ordinary drover, and that the men who had spooked it into the night had likely wanted him dead in the wash rather than found breathing in a rancher's barn, and that if word got out where he was, it might not only be his own life put in danger, but hers as well. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised them both. Emmett's shoulder was slow healing, worse than either of them had first judged, and Louisa found herself extending his stay past the week she had first intended, telling herself it was only good sense, that a half-healed man on the winter roads was a man likely to end up dead in a ditch and on her conscience. She did not examine too closely why the thought of him leaving left something small and unhappy sitting in her chest. He was, whatever else he might be hiding, a hard worker once his arm allowed it. He mended the fence the stampeding herd had broken, working left-handed and grimacing, but refusing her offers to let it wait. He fixed a hinge on the hay barn door that had been sagging since before her father died. He had a quiet way with the horses that Louisa noticed and admired despite herself, a patience that came, she suspected, from a man who had spent a great deal of his life being patient with things and people that did not wish to be handled. "You're not from New Mexico," she said one evening, the two of them working side by side to thaw a stock tank that had frozen solid despite the mild winter, breaking ice with mauls in the gray dusk light. "Texas, originally, came out this way some years back." He did not elaborate, and she noticed that too, filed it away with the growing list of things Emmett Prescott did not say. "Running from something." He looked up at that, and for a moment the careful stillness in his face cracked just enough for her to see something raw beneath it. "Everybody's running from something, Miss Langston. Some of us just get further than others." She did not press him further that night, though the question sat between them, unanswered, while they worked the ice into pieces and hauled the buckets to the trough, their breath clouding in the cold, the mild winter thaw already turning the yard to mud that would, in another week, turn to something far more dangerous. It was Colonel Holly's Vance, who nearly undid the careful peace of the barn, arriving unannounced on a bright, deceptively warm afternoon 8 days after Louisa had found Emmett bleeding in her hay. She heard the buggy before she saw it, recognized the particular jingle of Vance's matched bays, and had just enough time to duck into the barn and hiss a warning to Emmett, who was mending tack in the loft, before the colonel's buggy rolled into her yard with the easy confidence of a man who believed every acre he looked upon should rightfully belong to him. "Miss Langston." Vance descended from his buggy with the careful grace of a man 20 years past his prime but unwilling to admit it, his silver mustache trimmed to a fine point, his coat too fine for ranch country. I heard you had some trouble with a stampede a week or so back. Thought I'd ride out and see you'd come through it well. Kind of you, Colonel, though I notice you waited a week to ask. Louisa stood in the yard with her arms crossed, blocking, without appearing to block, the direct line of sight to the barn door. My fence took the worst of it. I'll be sending you a bill for the rails, seeing as it was your herd that came through my pasture. Something flickered behind Vance's pale eyes, gone as quickly as it came. Now, that's an unkind accusation. That herd was recovered stock, being driven back by the marshal's men last I heard. Nothing to do with the Vance Cattle Company. Funny, I heard it was rustled cattle running loose from your holding pens, before your men lost control of it, Louisa said, watching him carefully. Seems like there are two stories going around, Colonel, and I find myself curious which one is true. Vance's smile did not waver, but his eyes went cold in a way that made Louisa's hand itch for the rifle she had left leaning inside her kitchen door. Stories have a way of getting twisted in a valley this size, Miss Langston. What I know for certain is that a wanted man is loose somewhere between here and the Rio Ruidoso, the same man responsible for that stampede and for a good deal of rustling besides. And I'd hate for a woman alone out here to come to harm sheltering something she didn't understand. I shelter nothing but my own cattle and my own conscience, Colonel, Louisa said evenly. You needn't worry for me. I always worry for my neighbors. Vance's gaze drifted, almost lazily, toward the barn, and Louisa felt her heartbeat climb. That's a fine barn you've got there. Sturdy roof. My own hands could use a look at it. Happen you ever want an honest opinion on repairs? I manage my own repairs, Colonel, same as I manage everything else on this ranch, though I do thank you for the concern. She kept her voice light, though every muscle in her body had gone tight as wire. Was there something else you needed, or was this purely a social call? Vance held her gaze a moment longer than was comfortable, then inclined his head, the smile never quite leaving his mouth. Purely social, Miss Langston. Do give my regards to old Tomas. He climbed back into his buggy with the same unhurried grace, and Louisa did not let her shoulders drop until the sound of his bays had faded entirely down the road toward the county seat. She found Emmett in the loft exactly where she had left him, tack forgotten in his lap, his face carefully blank in a way that told her he had heard every word. You know him, she said. It was not a question. I know of him. Emmett set the tack aside and climbed down, favoring his healing shoulder. Colonel Hollis Vance owns near 40,000 acres between here and the Malpais, most of it bought up cheap from smaller outfits that couldn't hold on through a bad winter, and a fair amount more claimed from land-grant families who couldn't afford the lawyers to fight him in territorial court. You know a great deal for a man who says he's just passing through Texas by way of somewhere else. Emmett was quiet a moment, and Louisa watched him weigh something behind those gray eyes, watched him decide, finally, not to say it. I know what everybody in this valley knows, Miss Langston. Vance is a hard man to cross and an easy man to underestimate. I'd be careful how you speak to him. I've been careful for 2 years, Louisa said. I intend to keep being careful, but I won't be run off my father's land by a man who thinks a fine coat entitles him to whatever he can grab, and I won't pretend not to notice when he comes sniffing around a barn he's got no business being interested in. She left him then, because the conversation had gotten too close to something neither of them was ready to say outright, and it was 3 more days before she rode into the county seat at Lincoln for supplies, and found the notice pinned outside the sheriff's office that changed everything between them. The town of Lincoln in the last week of February was a muddy, thawing sprawl of adobe and clapboard strung along a single wide street, still bearing scars from the county's bloody troubles a few years past, though most folks these days preferred not to speak of that time too loudly. Louisa tied Duchess outside the mercantile and had just finished loading a sack of flour and a spool of barbed wire into her wagon when she noticed the small crowd gathered outside Sheriff Purdy's office, reading a fresh notice tacked to the post. She went to look, more from habit than expectation, and felt the blood drain from her face as she read it. Wanted for questioning, the notice declared, in the sheriff's own uneven hand. A man, height and build unknown, last seen NEAR the scene of the FEB 19 stampede on the RUIDOSO road, suspected of involvement in cattle rustling and possibly responsible for the theft of several head belonging to the VANCE Cattle Company. May be injured. Any person with information SHOULD report to the sheriff's office. A reward of $50 is offered for his apprehension. There was no name, no drawing, nothing but the vague description that could have applied to half the men in the territory. And yet Louisa felt the words settle over her like a shadow, because she knew, with a certainty that made her stomach turn, that the man being described was very likely sitting in her barn at that very moment, mending harness with his good hand, and telling her stories about Texas that were probably no truer than his name. "Terrible business," said Sheriff Ira Purdy, stepping out of his office and following her gaze to the notice. He was a heavy-set man with tired eyes and the particular weariness of someone who had seen enough of Lincoln County's troubles to want no more of them. "Colonel Vance is offering that reward out of his own pocket, says he wants the matter settled quick, before it stirs up more trouble than we need." "You have no name, Sheriff. No likeness. How do you expect anybody to identify this man?" Purdy shrugged, not unkindly. "Colonel Vance's foreman says he got a look at the fella during the stampede, before he lost his horse and ran off into the dark. Said he had the look of a drifter, dark hair, medium build, favored his right side like maybe he'd taken a hurt. That's about all we've got to go on, Miss Langston, until somebody turns up matching it." Louisa's mouth had gone dry. Every word of that description fit the man in her barn, down to the shoulder he still favored where her own stitches held the wound closed. "Seems mighty convenient," she said carefully, "that Colonel Vance is so quick to name a suspect for a herd he claims wasn't even his cattle." Purdy's tired eyes sharpened slightly. "I don't follow you." "Nothing, Sheriff. Only that I heard two stories about whose cattle those were, and I find it strange the Colonel's settled so firmly on one of them now that there's a reward to offer." She forced a smile she did not feel. "I'll keep an eye out, of course. Good day, Sheriff Purdy." She rode home with her supplies rattling in the wagon bed and her thoughts churning faster than the wagon wheels, turning over every conversation she'd had with Emmett Prescott, every careful evasion, every question he had turned aside with a half smile and a change of subject. By the time Duchess pulled into her own yard, Louisa Langston had made up her mind to have the truth out of him or send him down the road that very evening, whatever her heart might quietly wish otherwise. She found him in the barn, exactly where he always was these days, and she did not soften her approach. "There's a notice in Lincoln," she said, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, "describing a man suspected of rustling and involved in that stampede. Dark hair, medium build, favors his right side from an injury. $50 for his capture courtesy of Colonel Hollis Vance." She let the silence stretch. "Would you care to explain to me why that description fits you like a tailored coat, Mr. Prescott, or should I ride back to town and collect that reward myself?" Emmett set down the bridle he had been mending and faced her fully, and for the first time since she had found him bleeding in her hay, he did not try to soften what he was about to say. "Because I am the man they saw during that stampede," he said quietly, "though I promise you, on whatever you'd have me swear by, that I never rustled a single head of cattle in my life. I was driving that herd home, not stealing it, and somebody set that stampede deliberately to see me hurt or dead in the confusion, and I believe that somebody was working for Colonel Vance." Louisa stared at him, her heart hammering, torn between the instinct to reach for the rifle propped by the door and the stronger instinct, the one that had kept her alive and solvent these 2 hard years, that told her this man was not lying to her, not about this. "Then who are you?" she said, low and dangerous. "If you're not a rustler." Emmett was quiet a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. My name is Emmett Prescott, same as I told you, that much was never a lie. But I go by that name because it was my mother's, and I took it from her rather than keep the one I was born under. He drew a breath. I'm a deputy United States Marshal out of the Santa Fe office, assigned to Lincoln County to look into rustling in this district. And the herd we were driving that night wasn't Vance's cattle at all. It was stock recovered from a rustler's camp in the Malpais, belonging to half a dozen small outfits along this valley, San Rafael included. I believe Vance's men caused that stampede to scatter that herd back into the confusion where it could be claimed as lost, or blamed on somebody who couldn't defend himself. Louisa's mind was racing now, pulling threads together. And you didn't tell me because I didn't know who around here could be trusted, and because a man with a badge and no proof of it, found bleeding in a rancher's barn with a reward on his head, isn't exactly in a position to go knocking on the sheriff's door and expect a fair hearing. His gaze was steady on hers, gray eyes clear and unflinching despite the confession he had just made. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry for that. But I needed to know I wasn't handing you a danger you hadn't agreed to carry. I've been carrying it for over a week whether I agreed to it or not, Louisa said, though the anger in her voice had gone thin, worn down by the plain sincerity in his face. Why should I believe any of this, Mr. Prescott? A badge is easy to claim when you haven't got one to show. Because I lost mine in that wash along with my horse, same as I told you the truth about that part from the start, and because if you ride to Lincoln and wire the marshal's office in Santa Fe, they'll confirm every word I've said. Ask for Marshal Grady Sutton. He'll vouch for me. Emmett took a slow step closer, close enough that Louisa had to tip her head back to hold his gaze. I know I'm asking you to trust a stranger who's already lied to you once by omission. I wouldn't blame you for turning me out. But I give you my word, Louisa, that I have never once lied to you about who I am at the bottom of things, only about the shape of it. It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the sound of it, low and careful in his rough voice, settled the last of the fear rattling in her chest and left something else in its place, something she was not yet ready to name. I'll send the wire, she said finally. But you'll stay in that barn until I hear back, and you will not so much as think of leaving this ranch without telling me first. Do you understand me, Deputy Prescott? Something like relief, and something warmer beneath it crossed his face. Yes, ma'am. I understand you completely. The wire came back 4 days later, delayed by a downed line somewhere between Lincoln and Santa Fe, and it confirmed every word Emmett had told her. Marshal Grady Sutton's reply terse and worried in equal measure. EMMETT Prescott Deputy U.S. Marshal Stop, feared killed in stampede stop protect HIM, and advise soonest stop rustling investigation compromise stop trust no local authority until I arrive. Louisa read the wire twice over on the ride home, the mild afternoon sun doing little to warm the cold knot that had settled in her stomach at the words trust no local authority. And by the time she reached her own barn, she had already begun turning over, with the same careful practicality she brought to every problem on her ranch, exactly what needed to be done next. Your marshal says to trust no one local, she told Emmett, handing him the folded wire. That includes Sheriff Purdy, I take it. It does. Emmett read the wire twice, his jaw tightening. Heard he's not a bad man, but he's beholden to Vance for his last 2 elections, and he's not the sort to go looking too hard for a truth that'll cost him votes. If Vance tells him a story simple enough to believe, Purdy will believe it, especially with a reward already posted. Then we need our own proof, Louisa said. Something even a beholden sheriff can't argue with. Emmett looked at her for a long moment, something like surprise and something like admiration crossing his face in equal measure. You've been eating my food and mending my fences for 2 weeks, Mr. Prescott. I believe that entitles me to a stake in how this comes out. She held his gaze steadily. Besides, if Vance is willing to frame a wounded stranger for rustling, I doubt very much he'll stop there. There's a whole village down along the river that trades honest goods with half this valley, And I'd bet my last dollar Vance means to point his trail of stolen cattle straight at their door next, if he hasn't already. She was right, though neither of them yet knew how right, and the two of them spent that evening by lamplight at her kitchen table, piecing together everything Emmett had learned in his weeks investigating the rustling ring before the stampede, and everything Louisa knew of Vance's slow, patient campaign to claim every acre and every water right in the valley that did not already belong to him. It was Louisa who suggested they ride down to San Rafael the following morning, and it was there, among the adobe walls and cottonwood groves of the old land-grant village, that the last pieces of Vance's scheme began to come clear. San Rafael sat in a green crescent along the river bottom, its fields terraced in the old way, its acequias, the community irrigation ditches, still running clear and cold with snowmelt from the mountains despite the mild winter that had already begun eating away at the higher drifts. Doña Serafina Aragon received them in the courtyard of her adobe home with the wary courtesy of a woman who had learned, over 60 years of living in a territory that had changed hands more than once beneath her feet, that Anglo visitors rarely brought good news. "Miss Langston, I know," she said, studying Emmett with sharp dark eyes, "and I know you are an honest neighbor, whatever your countrymen may think of my people. This man I do not know. He's a deputy United States marshal, Doña Serafina, investigating the rustling that's been plaguing this valley," Louisa said. "We believe someone means to blame your village for the theft, to give Colonel Vance grounds to move against your land-grant claim once and for all." The old woman's face did not change, but something in her posture stiffened, an old and weary anger surfacing. "This would not be the first time such a thing has been tried. 12 years ago, a man very like your Colonel Vance accused my late husband's cousins of rustling stock that later turned up, quite alive, in that same man's own herd. The territorial court found against us anyway, because the judge owed favors to men in Santa Fe, and we lost 400 acres of good grazing land we had held since before your country existed here at all." "I'm sorry," Emmett said quietly, and he meant it, the words carrying a weight Louisa had not heard from him before, the weight of a man who had begun to understand that the badge he wore did not always point toward the truth. "I intend to see this doesn't happen the same way twice, if you'll help me understand what's been happening here these past weeks." Doña Serafina studied him a long moment, then gestured for them to sit, and over strong coffee and flat bread warmed on her hearth, she told them what she knew. That strange cattle had begun turning up grazing along the river bottom near San Rafael's boundary these past 3 weeks, animals nobody in the village had bought or bred, all carrying a brand that had been crudely altered, the original mark burned over and reshaped into something new. "My grandson found 6 head of them not 4 days past," she said, "and drove them back toward the open range, thinking them strays. If the sheriff comes looking for stolen cattle and finds them near our land, grazing where my grandson pushed them, what do you suppose he will believe?" Emmett's face had gone hard and still, the look of a man seeing a puzzle complete itself in a shape he did not like. "He'll believe exactly what he's meant to believe. Vance isn't just stealing cattle to sell. He's using the theft itself as a weapon, planting evidence to point straight at San Rafael, so that when the truth of the rustling finally breaks open, it breaks open onto your doorstep instead of his." "Can you prove this?" Doña Serafina asked, and there was something almost pleading beneath the pride in her voice, the exhaustion of a woman who had fought this fight before and lost. "Show me the brand," Emmett said. They rode out to the river bottom where the strange cattle still grazed, 6 rangy longhorns with the crudely altered mark scarred into their hides, and Emmett dismounted to examine the brand closely, running his fingers along the puckered scar tissue with the careful attention of a man who had studied 100 brands in his years of service. "This was Vance's own mark, originally," he said finally, straightening. "A V inside a circle. Somebody's altered it, added lines to make it look like an old Spanish brand, but the reshaping is recent, done with a running iron sometime this past month, and done badly. Whoever changed this brand wanted it to look like San Rafael stock without knowing enough about how brands actually age to make it convincing. Then we have our proof, Louisa said, though even as she said it, she understood how thin proof always was, out here, against a man with money enough to buy a jury's doubt. We have a start, Emmett corrected gently. But Purdy will need more than an altered brand to arrest a man like Vance, and Vance knows it. We need the men who actually ran that stampede, or we need Vance's own ledgers showing where those cattle came from and where he means to sell them. And we need it before he moves against San Rafael directly, which I'd guess is a matter of days now, not weeks. It was Doña Serafina who supplied the piece that turned days into hours. There is a line camp 2 hours' ride north of here in the foothills, she said, abandoned since autumn or so we believed. My grandson has seen Lantern light there 3 nights running. If Colonel Vance has men hiding stolen stock anywhere close to San Rafael, that is where I would look. They rode for it that same afternoon, the mild winter sun already beginning its long slide toward the western peaks, and it was there, in a narrow box canyon behind the abandoned line shack, that they found the heart of Vance's scheme laid bare. Nearly 200 head of cattle bearing altered brands, a ledger book half hidden beneath a bunk in the shack recording sales and dates in a careful, damning hand, and pinned to the wall above the bunk, a rough map showing a trail deliberately routed to pass through San Rafael's grazing allotment before turning north to a rail siding, a trail meant to be discovered, meant to point a finger of blame exactly where Vance wanted it pointed. This is enough, Emmett said, paging through the ledger with growing, grim satisfaction. This is more than enough if we can get it in front of a judge who isn't in Vance's pocket. And if Purdy raises a posse before then, believing the lie instead of the truth, Louisa asked, voicing the fear that had been building in her chest since Doña Serafina first spoke of her grandson's strays. As if in answer to her question, the drum of hoofbeats sounded from the canyon mouth behind them, and Emmett swore under his breath, shoving the ledger inside his coat. That'll be Vance's men, checking on their cattle, he said. We need to move now. They rode hard for San Rafael, the ledger and its damning proof tucked safe against Emmett's chest. And it was there, breathless and mud-spattered in Doña Serafina's courtyard, that they learned the worst of it from a young rider sent up from the village with news that made Louisa's blood run cold. Sheriff Purdy, acting on a fresh report from Colonel Vance's foreman claiming stolen cattle had been positively identified grazing on San Rafael land, had that very morning begun gathering a posse in Lincoln, intending to ride on the village within 2 days' time, to search every home and arrest any man who could not account for his whereabouts the night of the stampede. 2 days, Emmett said, his jaw tight. That's not enough time to ride to Santa Fe and back for Marshal Sutton. It's enough time to reach Lincoln ourselves and put this ledger in Purdy's hands before he rides, Louisa said, though even as she spoke the words, she was doing the arithmetic of distance and daylight in her head, and she did not like the answer it gave her. If we leave within the hour, we can make it by tomorrow evening, provided the road holds. It was Doña Serafina who voiced the danger that made even Emmett go pale. The road will not hold, child. Have you not seen the river this past week? This warm spell has melted snow faster than any February I remember, and the Rio Ruidoso is running higher than I have seen it in 10 years. The Torian crossing may already be underwater. Louisa closed her eyes briefly, picturing the low wooden crossing at Torian, the only bridge for 15 miles in either direction that could bear a wagon or a loaded horse across the swollen river, and understood, with the particular dread of someone who had lived her whole life on this unpredictable land, that reaching Lincoln in time might cost them a great deal more than a hard ride. Then we'd best start now, she said, and pray that bridge holds long enough for us to cross it. They rode through the night and into the gray hours of the following morning, changing horses once at a line camp belonging to a rancher Louisa trusted, pushing on with barely a rest, the ledger and map wrapped tight in oilcloth inside Emmett's coat. And it was near midday, with the sun doing its poor best to warm a sky heavy with fast-moving cloud, that they crested the last rise above the Torian crossing and understood at once that Doña Serafina's warning had not been exaggeration. The Rio Ruidoso had swollen into something almost unrecognizable, a churning brown flood tearing at both banks, carrying whole cottonwood limbs and once, sickeningly, the bloated carcass of a drowned steer, past the old wooden crossing that some enterprising rancher had built years before, a narrow span of timber and rope lashed between two stone piers, never meant to bear the weight of what the river was now doing to it. Even as they watched from the rise, a section of the downstream railing gave way with a crack audible even over the river's roar, timber spinning off into the flood. "That crossing won't hold much longer," Emmett said grimly. "But there's no other way across for miles, and we don't have miles to spare." Louisa studied the bridge, her rancher's eye assessing weight and stress the way she might assess a failing fence line, and felt her stomach tighten with a fear that had nothing to do with cowardice and everything to do with a clear-eyed understanding of what the water below that bridge could do to a body in less than a minute. "We lead the horses across on foot, single file, spaced well apart so we're not putting too much weight on any one span at once," she said. "If it starts to go, we go for the far bank, not back the way we came, because the current's already eating the upstream side worse." Emmett looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, something closer to a fierce and sudden respect. "You've crossed water like this before." "I've watched my father cross water like this before, and I watched him nearly not make it out the other side," Louisa said. "I don't intend to repeat his mistake. Lead your horse. Keep 3 lengths behind me." "And Emmett," she paused, and something passed between them, unspoken but understood before she finished. "If I go in, you let me go and you get that ledger to Lincoln. Do you understand me? This is bigger than either one of us now." "I understand you," Emmett said, "and I'm telling you now that I have no intention of letting that happen, so let's not waste breath arguing about it." They started across, Louisa first with Duchess picking her way with the delicate, mistrustful steps of a horse that knew better than her rider how dangerous the footing had become. The timbers slick with spray and groaning under each step. The river below, a deafening brown roar that seemed to reach up and pull at the edges of Louisa's courage with every passing second. She was perhaps 2/3 of the way across when the center span, already weakened by the earlier collapse of the railing, gave way beneath her with a crack like a rifle shot. The world tilted. Louisa felt the timber drop away beneath her boots and had just enough time to fling herself forward, grabbing for the next intact section of decking with both hands, her legs plunging into the icy rush of the flood as Duchess screamed and scrambled for footing on the far side, breaking free of the lead rope and lunging safely onto solid ground without her rider. "Louisa!" Emmett's voice cut through the roar of the water, and she twisted her head to see him already moving, dropping his own horse's lead and running across the shuddering bridge toward her, heedless of the timbers cracking beneath his boots. "Stay back, it won't hold both of us," she shouted, but he was already there, already dropping to his knees on the last solid section of decking, reaching for her wrists with both hands as the current tore at her legs and threatened to drag her fully into the flood. "I told you I wasn't letting that happen," he said through gritted teeth, hauling upward with every ounce of strength his healing shoulder could bear, and Louisa felt the timber beneath his knees groan ominously, even as she scrambled to find purchase with her boots against the slick stone pier below the decking. For one terrible moment neither of them moved, caught in a desperate balance between the pull of the river and the strength of his grip. And then Louisa found a foothold on a submerged stone and pushed with everything she had left, and together they came up and over the broken edge of decking in a tangle of soaked clothing and gasping breath, collapsing onto the last solid stretch of the bridge, as behind them, the section she had fallen through gave way entirely and vanished downstream in a spray of white water. They lay there a moment, both of them shaking, before Emmett rolled to his knees and helped her up, his hands lingering on her arms a beat longer than strictly necessary, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that had nothing to do with rustled cattle or altered brands. "You could have been killed," he said, low and rough. "So could you, coming out after me." Louisa's own voice was not entirely steady. "That was a foolish thing to do, Emmett Prescott." "Maybe." He did not let go of her arms. "I'd do it again, though, and I'd like it very much if you didn't make a habit of nearly drowning in front of me, because I don't believe my heart could take it a second time." There, on a half-collapsed bridge above a roaring river, with the far bank still to reach, and a village's fate hanging on how quickly they could finish their crossing, Louisa Langston felt something settle in her chest that she had been fighting for 2 weeks to deny, and she did not fight it any longer. "We'll discuss my heart's welfare and yours once we've saved San Rafael," she said, though she allowed herself, just for a moment, to lean into the solid warmth of him before pulling back and turning toward the remaining stretch of bridge. "Come on. We're not finished yet." They made the far bank without further mishap, gathered the horses, and pressed on toward Lincoln with wet clothes freezing stiff in the wind and the ledger, thankfully, still dry inside its oilcloth wrapping, and they rode into the county seat as the last light was fading from the sky, exhausted, soaked, and utterly determined. They found Sheriff Purdy at his office preparing for the morning's ride, a dozen deputized men already gathered outside sharing coffee and grim talk of San Rafael, and Colonel Hollis Vance himself standing at Purdy's elbow, immaculate as ever despite the late hour, his silver mustache twitching with something like satisfaction when he saw who had ridden into town. "Well," Vance said smoothly, though Louisa caught the flicker of alarm beneath his composure, "if it isn't Miss Langston, and the very man half this county's been searching for these past 2 weeks." "Sheriff Purdy," Emmett said, ignoring Vance entirely and stepping forward with the ledger already in hand, "my name is Emmett Prescott, Deputy United States Marshal, assigned to investigate the rustling in this district. I have proof here that the cattle you mean to search for at San Rafael tomorrow were planted there deliberately, and proof of who did the planting." Purdy's tired eyes flicked between Emmett and Vance, uncertainty warring with the exhaustion of a man who had hoped this matter would resolve itself simply. "That's a serious claim, Deputy, if that's truly what you are. I'll need to see some proof of your identity before I take the word of a man who's been hiding from a wanted notice for 2 weeks. He's been hiding from a wanted notice that Colonel Vance himself posted, based on a description manufactured by his own foreman," Louisa said, stepping forward beside Emmett, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "I sent a wire to Marshal Grady Sutton in Santa Fe myself, Sheriff, and received confirmation of everything Deputy Prescott has told us. You can wire the same office yourself if you doubt me." Vance's composure finally cracked, a flush rising up his neck. "This is absurd. Sheriff, these two have clearly been conspiring together, likely to protect whatever thieves they've been sheltering out at the Langston place." "The only thing I've been sheltering, Colonel," Louisa cut in, her voice ringing clear across the muddy street, loud enough that the deputized men outside turned to listen, "is a wounded lawman who nearly died because someone stampeded a herd of recovered cattle directly through his camp in the dead of night. Cattle that included stock stolen from half a dozen small ranchers in this valley. Stock that your own men then rebranded and drove toward San Rafael's grazing land, hoping to see an innocent village blamed for your crime." "Lies," Vance snapped, but his voice had lost its earlier smoothness. Emmett opened the ledger and set it on Purdy's desk, turning it to face the sheriff directly. "This is Colonel Vance's own record, Sheriff, in a hand I'd wager you'll recognize if you've ever seen his correspondence at the bank. Dates, numbers of head, buyers at the rail siding north of here. And this?" He laid the crude map beside it, shows the trail his men were meant to leave, routed deliberately through San Rafael's boundary before turning toward that same siding. My deputies and I recovered nearly 200 head bearing an altered Vance Cattle Company brand at an abandoned line camp not 10 miles from here, not 4 hours ago. The street outside had gone quiet, the deputized men drifting closer to the office door, listening now with open suspicion on their weathered faces, several of whom, Louisa noted, were small ranchers themselves who had likely lost stock to the very rustling ring Vance had orchestrated. Sheriff Purdy studied the ledger for a long, silent moment, his face going through several changes before settling into something grim and resolved. "This is your handwriting, Colonel. I've seen it on enough banknotes to know it plain. I want a proper investigation before any accusations are made," Vance said, though the fight had gone out of his voice, replaced by the brittle edge of a man watching his careful plans collapse in real time. "You'll have one," Emmett said. "A thorough one once Marshal Sutton arrives from Santa Fe, which I expect will be within 2 days, given the wire Miss Langston sent. In the meantime, Sheriff, I'd suggest you hold Colonel Vance here in Lincoln, rather than let him ride home to burn whatever else might be found on his property." Purdy looked at Vance for a long moment, and something like shame crossed his tired face, the recognition of a man who understood he had nearly ridden a posse into an innocent village on the word of the very man who had orchestrated the crime. "Hollies, I'm going to need you to stay in town until this is sorted proper. I'm sorry it's come to this, but I won't be made a fool of twice in one county." Vance's mask slipped fully then, fury and desperation flashing bare across his face, and for one tense moment Louisa thought he might reach for the pistol at his hip, but the deputized men outside the office, several of whom had already begun murmuring darkly about their own missing cattle, closed in around the doorway, and Vance seemed to understand, with the cold calculation that had built his empire in the first place, that the moment for violence had passed him by. "This isn't finished," he said, low and venomous, as 2 of Purdy's men stepped forward to relieve him of his sidearm. "I expect a circuit judge will have quite a lot to say about whether it's finished or not, Colonel," Emmett said evenly. "And I expect the good people of San Rafael will finally get the chance to tell their side of a story that's been decided against them for far too long without ever being properly heard." Marshal Grady Sutton arrived from Santa Fe 2 days later, a broad, weathered man in his 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and his arrival settled the last uncertainties hanging over the case with brisk efficiency. He confirmed Emmett's identity, and standing to the whole of Lincoln in terms that left no further room for doubt, took formal custody of the ledger and map as evidence, and dispatched riders to gather statements from the small ranchers whose stolen stock had been recovered, as well as from Doña Serafina and half a dozen other San Rafael families whose long years of quiet grievance against Vance's encroachments would, for the first time, be entered into an official territorial record. "You did good work here, Prescott," Sutton told Emmett on the evening of his arrival, the 2 of them standing outside the Lincoln jail where Vance now sat awaiting the circuit judge's arrival. "Though I understand it wasn't entirely your own doing, Miss Langston, I'm told, rode into a flooding river to see this evidence delivered." "Miss Langston did considerably more than that, sir," Emmett said, and there was a warmth in his voice that Sutton, being an observant man, did not fail to notice. "I wouldn't have survived that stampede at all if she hadn't found me first, and I certainly wouldn't have gotten that ledger to Lincoln without her beside me the whole way." Sutton's weathered face creased into something like a knowing smile. "That's so." He studied Emmett a long moment. "You've done fine work in this territory, son, better work than most men twice your years in the service. But I've watched you these past 2 years, and I've never once seen you settle anywhere long enough to call it home. Something tells me that might be about to change." Emmett did not answer directly, but the truth of it was already settling into his chest, plain and undeniable, and later that evening, When the town had quieted and Louisa sat beside him on the porch of the boarding house where Sutton had arranged rooms for them both, he found himself saying it aloud for the first time. "I've been thinking about what you asked me that first week in the barn," he said, "whether I was running from something." Louisa turned to look at him in the lamplight spilling from the window behind them. "And my father's name was Silas Coulter," Emmett said quietly. "He was hanged in Texas when I was 16 years old for cattle rustling and for a killing that came of it, and I have spent every year since trying to prove I was made of different stuff than he was. I took my mother's name, Prescott, and I built a life around it, and I told myself that was enough, that wearing a badge instead of running from one was proof enough that I'd become a different man." He paused, gathering himself. "But I never once made it official, Louisa. Emmett Prescott is the name I go by, but it's not the name on any legal paper anywhere in this territory. I've been half a man these 10 years, borrowing a name the way a fugitive borrows a hiding place, always ready to shed it if the truth ever caught up with me." Louisa was quiet a moment, absorbing this, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle in a way he had not often heard from her. "And now I find myself wanting, for the first time in my life, to make that name permanent. Not to hide behind it any longer, but to claim it outright, in front of a judge and the law both, as the man I actually am rather than the man I'm pretending to be, while I wait for my father's shadow to catch up with me." He turned to face her fully. "I want to change my name legally, Louisa, from Coulter to Prescott, once and for all. And I find that I want to do it here, in this territory, because this is where I finally found a reason worth being an honest man for." Louisa's eyes were bright in the lamplight, and when she reached for his hand, her fingers were steady despite everything they had survived together these past weeks. "I think that's a fine reason, Emmett Prescott," she said softly, "though I'll admit I'm curious what other reasons you might have in mind." "Only every reason there is," he said, and drew her hand to his lips, and there on the boarding-house porch, with the mild winter night settling soft and clear over Lincoln County, he kissed her properly for the first time, and neither of them pulled away until long after the lamp behind them had guttered low. The circuit judge arrived within the week, and the proceedings against Colonel Hollis Vance unfolded with a thoroughness that left little room for his considerable fortune to buy him mercy. The ledger, the altered brand, the map, and the sworn statements of a dozen ranchers, Anglo and Hispanic alike, whose stolen stock had passed through his hands, proved more than sufficient, and the judge, a stern circuit rider named Judge Ambrose Kelleher with no evident loyalty to the Santa Fe ring or its beneficiaries, sentenced Vance to a lengthy term in the territorial prison, along with restitution to every rancher he had wronged, San Rafael's long-disputed grazing allotment included. The judge ruling firmly that the land grant claim, backed now by clear evidence of the community's innocence and the malice of its accuser, stood valid and unchallenged. Doña Serafina wept openly at the reading of that judgment, and Louisa, standing beside Emmett in the crowded Lincoln courtroom, found her own eyes unexpectedly wet as well, understanding fully for the first time the weight of what they had accomplished together, not merely the clearing of Emmett's name, but the righting of a wrong that had been allowed to fester in that valley for far longer than a single winter. It was 2 weeks later, on a morning warm enough that the last patches of snow had finally retreated fully into the high peaks, and the Rio Ruidoso had settled back into its familiar banks, that Emmett stood before Judge Kelleher's traveling clerk in Lincoln and signed the papers that made his chosen name his true one at last, Emmett Silas Prescott. No longer a borrowed shield, but a name entirely his own, chosen and claimed and finally, fully honest. "Silas," Louisa said afterward, reading the signed document over his shoulder with a small, curious smile, "you kept your father's given name." "I did," Emmett said. "Seemed wrong to erase him entirely, as though he never existed at all, and wrong besides to let his worst mistakes be the only thing that survives of him. But the name that follows it now is mine, chosen freely, and it's the name I intend to build the rest of my life around, provided, and here his voice softened, uncertain for the first time in weeks, provided you'll have me build that life somewhere close to your own. They were married in San Rafael's small adobe chapel that spring, a modest ceremony attended by Doña Serafina and half the village, alongside Louisa's ranch hands, and a scattering of Lincoln's honest citizens. Marshal Grady Sutton standing witness with evident satisfaction, and a gift of good New Mexico whiskey that he swore had been meant for exactly this occasion, though he had carried it for 2 years without cause to open it. Emmett resigned his commission as deputy marshal that summer, not out of any disillusionment with the work, but because he and Louisa had begun to see a different future taking shape, one built not on chasing outlaws through mountain country but on something steadier and, to both their minds, more lasting. The Torian Crossing, that treacherous stretch of river that had nearly claimed Louisa's life and had proven itself unsafe for a generation of travelers before her, needed rebuilding, and needed rebuilding properly, with stone piers and heavy timber that could withstand 100 mild winters and their sudden floods. They built it together that summer and fall, Louisa's ranching profits and Emmett's modest savings from his years in service pooled toward the labor and materials, and alongside the new bridge they raised a small way station, offering fresh horses, honest lodging, and safe passage across the river to travelers moving between Lincoln and the mountain settlements beyond, a business that served San Rafael's farmers and Louisa's fellow ranchers alike, undoing in some small, practical way the harm that had so nearly been done in that valley. They called it Prescott Crossing, and within the year it had become a fixture of the district, known up and down the territory as a place where a traveler could find fair dealing, a hot meal, and a safe way over water that had once been feared by everyone who lived along its banks. Louisa kept her father's ranch running alongside it, her herds grown healthy and her fences sound, and in the evenings, when the day's work was finally done, she and Emmett would sit together on the porch of the house they had built overlooking both the ranch and the crossing, watching the river run clear and steady in the last light, and neither of them ever again doubted the name they had chosen to build their lives around, nor the love that had grown, unlikely and unstoppable. Out of a stampede in the dark and a wounded stranger hiding in a barn who had found, at last, every reason a man could ever need to become exactly who he wished to be.